I am so excited today that we are being joined by Mike Grunwald talking about his new book, We Are Eating the Earth. I am going to share a little bio about him in a minute. He is an incredibly impressive writer, author, but also just a really nice human being. And so we're so excited to have a conversation with him today. Um, and before we do that, I'm going to give you a couple little pieces of ReFed news and also tell you who in the world I am if you don't know that. So starting with that, I am Sara Burnett. I am our Executive Director here at ReFed. I am filling in today for Dana Gunders. And so I'm very excited. Thank you for having me. And kind of the first news for ReFed today is kind of who we are. A lot of you might not be familiar with who ReFed is. We are a national nonprofit. We are focused exclusively on reducing food waste, the enormous amount of food that is wasted across the US today. We work with every type of stakeholder imaginable. We work with business leaders, policymakers, innovators, who are all doing work in this area. But part of our biggest action is around collective action, is actually reaching out to the community, getting people engaged and informed so that you can take action in your daily life, whether that's professionally or personally. And that's what some of these webinars are all about, is really getting that information and sharing it with all of our friends and those in the audience. And the other couple quick announcements about different tricks and tools that you can use. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to skip first to an upcoming webinar that you have is the PACT Town Hall. So one of those stakeholders that we work with is business leaders. And these are food business leaders across the supply chain who are part of our US Food Waste Pact. They have a town hall coming up, which we're going to look back at kind of the progress that all of these businesses have made. Spoiler alert, they've made a lot of progress and are doing some incredible work in a pretty competitive format. And also look at where we're going in the year ahead. This is open to anybody. So you can come and learn about, what some of the top retailers are doing, some QSRs and more, learn about what they're doing around food waste. So please join us on October 22nd. The next thing I would tell you about is a great resource for you. A lot of questions we get are, how much is being wasted here? Where is food being wasted? Look to our annual report. It's called From Surplus to Solutions. It's an annual report. We just launched it earlier this year, and that's available now on our website. So please keep an eye out for that. And if you are looking for an answer, definitely go look in that report. You're always open to reach out to us here at ReFed, but we do find that this is a pretty good read, so please check it out. And then last but not least is the ReFed Food Waste Summit. This is the place to be if you're a funder, an innovator, a food business, join us at the Food Waste Solutions Summit. We're going down south this year to Charlotte, North Carolina, and we're very excited to have you join us. The great news is ticket sales actually open today. And I will also say there is early bird pricing today as well. So for folks who know are going to be joining us, sign up and get your ticket now. There is going to be a link in the chat so that you can go ahead and register for that. And then without further ado, I'm going to get into our conversation. And I'm very excited to invite Mike Grunwald to join me. I do want to share just a little bit of context about him personally. He is a best-selling author. He is a former staff writer for Politico, Washington Post, Time Magazine. He's won many awards, the George Polk Award for National Reporting, the Worth Bingham Prize for Investigative Reporting, and many other journalism honors. I would say we are super excited that he started tiptoeing into food systems and writing about that, which is super exciting. And we're going to talk a little bit about today. He has his latest book, which we're going to be focusing on today, is We Are Eating the Earth. But he's also the author of two other critically acclaimed books, The Swamp, The Everglades, Florida, and The Politics of Paradise, which was adapted for a PBS documentary. So you might have seen it there as well. And The New Deal, The Hidden Story of Change in the Obama Era, which spent 4 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. So plenty of great writings already to date, but we are super excited to talk with you today, Mike, about We Are Eating the Earth and dig into a little bit of questions. So welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So I think that, to start off with, I think I'm kind of intrigued myself of saying you're a former political reporter. You've had lots of very interesting stories throughout the years, interesting books that I have personally read as well. Um, but you've never really covered food systems. Like, what led you to start being interested in saying, I need to write about this? I really need to uncover some truths here. What led you there?
Well, that's right. I mean, I've been a policy reporter for like 20 years, and I've always written a lot about the environment and the climate, which for me always meant writing about energy, right? Um, and I think for a lot of people. So I had done a little bit about biofuels.
Mm-hmm.
Writing about them is essentially a land scam. Uh,
Yeah.
and the sort of short answer is biofuels are eating about a Texas worth of the earth, and
Mm-hmm.
agriculture is eating 75 Texas's worth of the earth. And I started to realize that, agriculture uses 70% of our fresh water, that our food system is the largest driver of water pollution, and it's a third of our climate problem. It's a huge biodiversity loss driver, habitat loss, and I didn't know squat about it.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, I decided, I ought to sort of figure it out, and that was a little more than 5 years ago, and it was a slog, but a lot of people are angry about it and accusing me of all kinds of bias. But I can honestly say that I came into it with no preconceived notions because I really knew basically nothing.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's interesting to get that outside perspective because many of us in the food system are very close to it and maybe somewhat biased by some of it. I mean, that stat blew my mind that you just said. I think 75 Texas worth, and that is insane. And then to your point, a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. You know, selfishly for us being slightly biased, 8% of global greenhouse gases is food waste alone. So we are definitely very well aware of the impact of the food system on our environment, as well as in our communities and many other ways that they impact. Um, what were you hoping to accomplish with this? Like, what did you want to get out into the world? What was your goal?
Well, I mean, essentially, agriculture is a really big problem, right? The food system is driving all kinds of environmental, disasters.
Mhm.
And, but we got to eat, right? And so, having come from this energy background where we actually know what we need to do on the energy side, basically, we got to electrify the global economy and run it on clean electricity.
Mhm.
Um, and we're actually starting to do that. There's been this incredible clean energy revolution. When I started writing about energy and climate 20 years ago, there were no alternative to fossil fuels. And in
Mhm.
fact, I mean, there'd just been a new movie had come out called "Who Killed the Electric Car?" And as I said, there were just starting to be biofuels, but those turned out to be environmentally disastrous. And now it's incredible. 95% of all new electricity generation in the world last year was clean. It was solar or wind. Um,
Mhm.
so on food, not only didn't we know the answers, we didn't even know the questions. And it felt like here is this thing that I was spectacularly ignorant about, and I realized kind of the world was pretty ignorant about, and
Mhm.
was not really grappling with these massive problems. And uh, and so when you ask what the goal was for people to grapple. Um, and uh, and oh boy, they're grappling. I've taking hooks out of my back every day.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about some of those hooks, but I do, to your point, energy, there is kind of this clear here's the takeaway. We need to go from A to B, and there's the path to get there. I think the EV that I have parked out in my driveway is proving that point. But in food systems, it's a little bit to your point. There are definitely some big buckets of work that we know we need to take action on. But I would really be interested in you. Like, what were your key takeaways? What were those things that you said, this is what we need to take action on now, that came out of your research?
Well, the big one, I mean, and it says it in big letters on the cover, on the bright orange cover, is
Mhm.
that we are eating the earth. And that
Mhm.
sounds super obvious. But we hear so much about, for example, urban sprawl and the way our cities and suburbs are sort of moving into nature
Mhm.
and creating these kind of environmental problems. But cities and suburbs are about 1% of the Earth's habitable land. Farms and pastures are about 40%.
Mhm.
We are losing a soccer field worth of tropical forest to agriculture every 6 seconds, right? Our
Mhm.
farms now cover, it's like all of Asia plus all of Europe. I mean, it's a really big deal. And it sounds, any of us who've taken a cross-country flight, you look out the window and you see all the squares and the circles, and you say
Mhm.
like, oh yeah, there's a lot of agriculture out there. But there is a lot of agriculture out there. And we are on track to deforest another dozen Californias worth of land by 2050. And we don't have another dozen Californias worth of forest to spare, right? The line in the environmental community is always that there's no planet B. Well, we would need a planet B if we continue on the trajectory that we're on. So that's the main takeaway, is that we are going to have to make a lot more food, about 50% more food to feed nearly 10 billion people by 2050. And we're going
Mhm.
to have to do it with less land and about 80% fewer emissions if we're going to stick to our Paris climate targets. Because even if we all stopped using fossil fuels tomorrow, like everyone, all 8 billion of us around the world, we would still blow through those targets if we don't fix our food systems. So that's the big macro takeaway. And then of course I got deeper into the problems and as well as the solutions. But that's the big one. We can't keep eating the earth.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, land use, I do agree with you that there's not enough attention to land use, and to your point, agricultural land use and that land change and the impact that it's having. It Where does food waste come into play for that?
Well, it's a huge deal, right? Because we waste globally, and I know people argue about this, but I would say about a quarter of our food, right? And that means we waste a quarter of the farmland we use to grow the food. We waste a quarter of the fertilizer, which creates nitrous oxide emissions and a dead zone the size of Connecticut in the Gulf of Mexico. We waste a quarter of the water, right? That's parching the Colorado River and the aquifers under California. Um, and as you said, it's what, 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Right now, we are using a landmass the size of China to grow garbage. So
Mhm.
food waste, it's an environmental issue, it's a climate issue, and it's of course also an economic issue in that the average American household, I mean, it used to be what it was, we waste $1,500 a year on food that doesn't make it to our stomachs, and now it's even more. So I think this is food waste is very much a part of the story. As you guys know, in my original outline for the book, I actually was going to have an entire chapter about food waste.
Mhm.
That didn't happen. My feedback from the editors was fewer chapters, please, shorter book, please. And But there is, I definitely talk about food waste, about the difference between in the developed world, where most of our food waste is near the fork in our
Yep.
households and restaurants, as opposed to the developing world, where it's usually near the farm from really old-fashioned farming equipment that leaves food out on the crops on the field to rot, or
Mhm.
bad storage where you get mold or you get the rats, or really terrible transportation networks that can't get the food to market in time, no cold storage. So it's a very different situation. I talked about some of the policies as well as some of the technologies that can help, but yeah, I didn't have a food waste chapter, and I apologize.
We will accept your apology, and acknowledge too that it is. I mean, I think we're all in agreement that it is a huge part of the story. And when you think about all of the components that are going to, unfortunately, I don't think it's ever going to be as simple as EV. It's not going to be, you know, greening the grid is the one solution. Like, to fix the food system, to your point, there's a lot of different things that a lot of problems we have to tackle, and a lot of different solutions. There's unfortunately not just one.
That's right. And I should point out that, like, one of the attacks on the book, and I know we'll get to all of them,
Yeah.
but one of them has been essentially, we don't need to make more food. We just need to waste less food. And of course, I agree that we need to waste less food. But the fact is that even if the entire world cut food waste and food loss in half, which I know is kind of your at Refed, and you guys, I should say for everybody watching, Refed does an amazing job as a sort of think tank, as a convener, as a looking at these different technologies. It's really awesome. But even if the world did reduce food waste in half, and by the way, even if the rich world reduced meat consumption in half, we would still need to make more food with less land. So as you say, this is going to be, there isn't a silver bullet. And I do notice that a lot of the people who say like, oh, well, this isn't really a problem, we can just reduce food waste. I notice that those people are usually not people who work on food waste.
Mhm.
Um, they're like, I'm working on my little thing and I want somebody else to solve the problem. Oh.
Well, we recognize that it is a complicated problem and it is multiple solutions, multiple problems that we actually have to solve to get to truly a sustainable food system. Um, I think that, the one thing is that um, your book says that we need to, like, let me reframe this because I'm not going to read it direct off my script, but in terms of food waste, and in terms of all these other key takeaways, food waste is one of those. I think you and I are completely aligned, and a lot of people are aligned. We have to stop wasting so much food, hands down. Stupidest problem that ever existed, right? Why would we waste food, all the resources and everything that goes into that? But what are the few other pillars that you think we need to really focus on when you look at your book? Are there a handful of other things that you think are priorities?
Sure. And yeah, I mean, right. Food waste on the demand side it's the obvious one, right? Because
Mhm.
unlike, the other big thing on the demand side, other than biofuels, which are, as I said, they're a small part of the problem, but they're really crazy. And we should not be using valuable farmland to grow energy. It's incredibly, unbelievably inefficient. But food waste is definitely one of the big ones. And the other one is meat consumption and particularly beef consumption because three-quarters of our agricultural land is used to support livestock. It's mostly pasture, but also growing crops that we feed to livestock.
Mhm.
And look, animals are just, eating plants is a lot more efficient than eating animals that eat plants.
Mhm.
And beef and other ruminants happen to be spectacularly inefficient converters of their feed into our food. They use about 10 times as much land per calorie or per gram of protein as poultry or pork. And so again, now like when I tell people like we got to eat less meat, people are like, no, but I like eating meat. And so that's a problem. While when I tell people we need to waste less food, it's sort of like, okay, well, I don't really like wasting food. So food waste ought to be easier. It's not quite the same kind of third rail type political issue, too, right? I quoted somebody in the book, a pollster, who told me that sort of restrictions or basically anything designed to make people eat less meat are the least popular public policies he's ever polled, up there with like veterans benefits for ISIS was his quote. While food waste, it's actually kind of popular and bipartisan.
Mhm.
So anyway, I'm sort of very bullish on food waste solutions, while meat, and whether it's through alternative proteins or nudges or trying to other ways to try to get people to eat less meat, that's clearly going to be even harder. That's the demand side. Then I also talk about the supply side, and that's where I often get into a lot of trouble. Not
Mhm.
that the meat stuff doesn't get me into trouble. But basically, like I said, we're going to need to make more food with less land. And that means high yield agriculture. If you make more food per acre, you don't need as many acres to make the same amount of food. You don't need as much of the earth. And so there are all kinds of solutions. Some of them, the kind of industrial agriculture that everybody hates today, whether it's, fertilizers and irrigation and pesticides, like I wrote about in the New York Times on Sunday.
Mhm.
Um, and they're high yield seeds, automated factory farms that treat animals like widgets. There are these things that really have, through the Green Revolution, have really tripled crop and livestock yields over the last 50 years. And part of the solution is going to be importing some of those solutions to the poor smallholders in Africa and elsewhere in the world who really could use a little bit of fertilizer and some of those other solutions. But in general, higher yield crops and higher yield livestock are going to be very important. The other solution, and I'm putting it in quotes, that you hear about a lot, is the kind of regenerative carbon farming. This idea that we don't really need to make more food, we can just farm differently, and all the kind of bad carbon that we've pumped up into the atmosphere is going to be sort of magically repatriated as good carbon in our agricultural soils. There are movies like Kiss the Ground and Common Ground and Carbon Cowboys that kind of give this notion that just kinder and gentler and more natural farming is really the answer to our climate problems. And while there are some really nice things about some regenerative practices, they really are not a climate solution. The carbon farming aspect of it in particular, I really kind of debunk in the book as pretty bogus. Um, there are some really good things about cover crops and no-till farming. And I did some reporting in Brazil on some farms that use a lot of regenerative practices, particularly rotational grazing and letting the cattle sort of graze cover crops. And they have kick-ass yields. So
Mhm.
they're making more beef per acre, so they're using fewer acres of the Amazon to make beef. That's great. That's awesome. But in general, I'm very skeptical of that as climate solution. So I end up focusing more on the demand side, whether that's alternative proteins or reducing food waste, or the supply side, basically making more food. And there are all kinds of exciting technologies that can help us do that.
Yeah. Well, let me comment about the two demand side, and then I want to push a little bit on the regen side and
Mhm.
I'm sure that's where you're probably getting a lot of feedback from, positive and negative. And so
Oh yeah.
on the, my only thing here is I just have to throw out, I mean, ideal world is say, hey, how do we actually get us to actually reduce food waste. And when we start in that is focusing on those high intensity products. Like actually, let's try to focus on reducing waste of meat and dairy and high
Yes.
impact products, and get, a double whammy, like more bang for your buck in terms of investing in those solutions. So I hear you.
That's a really great point, and one that I don't think I even made in the book. That's like that's you're exactly right. Yeah, I always say that the two most important things that any individual can do to reduce the impact of their diet is eat less beef and waste less food.
Yeah.
But I hadn't thought of saying waste less beef.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something interesting to think about. What is going into your trash or your compost, and if it is those higher impact, how do we work on that first? But in terms of the regenerative, I think probably my assumption is that's where you get a lot of criticism because there's a lot of trade-offs in those. To your point, high intensity animal ag can have some negative externalities and have definitely impact on animal care. Do you think that, to your point of what you saw in Brazil, do you think there are models out there that work that would answer your call of how do we get, and I hate to say intensive because to some people say people think that that's extractive. Is there a model where you can have intensive agriculture, but it actually balances all of those trade-offs in a way that actually works for all the stakeholders? Are
Well, I
there
think
more models
first
than
of all,
Brazil?
yeah, well, first of all, I think intensive is a good word, right? It's the
Okay.
opposite of extensive, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm fighting. I'm fighting agriculture that takes over the world.
Mm-hmm.
I want agriculture to be intensive in the same way you see it a lot in the sort of housing debate, where we want kind of high density, in one place so that it doesn't sprawl all over into nature. I see it here in South Florida, we're, sprawling into the Everglades. So yeah, I do think intensive and productive is good. And yes, like I saw in Brazil, some of those regenerative practices, to the extent that they can help with yields, with intensity, with productivity, that's fantastic, and I'm all for it. Now, generally, organic farming, you tend to have a 20 to 40% yield hit, which means you use 20 to 40% more land to make the same amount of food. And we saw what happened in Sri Lanka, where they went all organic. They banned agricultural chemicals, they banned pesticides, they banned fertilizers, and immediately their yields crashed. They had food shortages, they had food riots, the government fell, the president had to flee. It's not a good model. And like again, you make more food, it becomes more accessible, more affordable. I think these are all really good things. Now, so that those farms in Brazil where I did see, some regenerative practices contributing to kick-ass yields, they also had feedlots. And it turns out that, organic grass-fed beef is way worse for the climate than green finished feedlot beef. Because partly it uses more land and partly it takes them longer to get to slaughter weight. So they're alive longer, burping and farting methane. So again, they in Brazil they fertilized their pastures, which Michael Pollan would hate that. Um, I do think there's some good environmental on-farm benefits. Like I went to Tom Steyer's regenerative ranch outside San Francisco, and they were having some really good results with the biodiversity of their grasses. They were having excellent water retention and soil, and they were reducing soil erosion. When there was rainfall, it wasn't like the soil wasn't washing down the hills,
Mhm.
and they were maintaining their soil. That was great. But they were taking carbon measurements, and it was actually they were losing soil carbon. So again, I'm very skeptical of it as a climate solution, but there are some nice things about it. I just do think because, look, Michael Pollan's a great writer, but you all have read too much Michael Pollan. And he has this notion that sort of the intensification of farming was the environmental crime, that there were these original, nice, rustic, bucolic farms where the soil was treated with love and the animals had names instead of numbers. And then they were intensified into these awful chemical drenched monoculture factory farms. Um, and there was, as you mentioned, there were definitely some downsides to that intensification, right? The treating animals badly, treating people badly. Their politics usually suck. Um, they are using too many antibiotics. They are creating. They're dumping their fertilizer into the river or into the streams, doing all kinds of really bad things. But they are making a lot of food. And over the next 30 years, agriculture is going to have to produce more food than it's produced over the last 12,000. And it turns out that the real environmental disaster of agriculture was the initial transformation of nature into those nice Michael Pollan farms. That's when you lost most of the biodiversity. That's when you lost most of the carbon. And so I really think agriculture's big job over the next 30 years is to not expand its footprint, to be intensive rather than extensive. And, reducing waste will help that. The less we waste, the less we need to expand to make more food. But I do think that a lot of the regenerative movement, and it's a very powerful movement right now, supported by the UN, supported by, a lot of big agribusinesses, a lot of big food companies, General Mills, a lot of big philanthropies, big environmental groups. But they kind of hand wave away this idea that we are going to need more food with less land. They think that's somebody else's problem, and I think it's everybody's problem.
Well, I think there's two things that we definitely can agree on. Is one, I don't think that we have yet found what the ideal version of agriculture is, to your point, that meets all of these different challenges that we're facing. So I think we can agree there. And for example, I worked extensively in my career on antibiotic use and reducing antibiotic use in animal ag. Huge problem, huge public health crisis related to that. So I think there's always these balances, and I appreciate that you understand that all those different trade-offs. Um, You receiving, I mean, obviously criticism, some of this for some of us who've read lots of Michael Pollan, and then others, I think I actually probably have some old books on my shelf
Oh, me
behind
too.
me.
I've got him right
But,
here. He's a
but
beautiful
I will
writer.
also say, you've been getting criticism on a couple different issues here, but anything that you would share about how you face that? Because I also would say, I think all of your challenges, personally, I believe all your challenges are really fair. And I actually think we need that outside perspective sometimes when we're in the food system, that saying, hey, from an outside perspective, here, if I'm reviewing it from an outside perspective, there's a very different view. And that actually sometimes that friction and tension is what actually leads to really interesting solutions and outcomes. So like how have you been handling that criticism and that tension that I think you probably appropriately created and probably somewhat intentionally did. You wanted to create a conversation, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm a big boy, and I don't mind being yelled at. Maybe lately I've started to mind it a little bit more. But I do think, in food and ag, I do like everybody's in there, I guess it's an ag pun, but everybody's in their silos. And I do think that these different groups, the vegans, the carnivores, the aggies, the foodies, the hippies, I do think the regenerative types, everybody, I do think the different groups can learn from each other, and I do think there's sort of a surprising amount of common ground. Look, I think some of the attacks, like I did write that big New York Times story a while ago, where they put a headline that made it sound like basically that I was just flacking for industrial agriculture, when what I really am flacking for is sort of high yield, low mess agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I think there's some industrial agriculture. Some industrial agriculture can be, you know, can voluntarily or through more sticks as opposed to carrots. I think it can make less mess. And actually, antibiotics is an area where, in some cases, they really there have been improvements in using less. Um, I think some of this it's just tough, right? Like when I write about beef, like everybody who loves beef yells at me because I'm saying eat less beef. And then the
Mm-hmm.
vegans are yelling at me because I don't say like the answer is obvious. We just have to eat no meat,
Yeah.
right? And I'm always like, yeah, well, we ate 450 million tons last year, so how's that going? And then even people who aren't that, the alternative protein people are angry at me because I'm also saying yes, but we also need to make beef more efficiently, right? If beef was only 4 times as bad as chicken or pork rather than 10 times, we'd save a huge amount of forest and wetlands and a huge amount of carbon. And some people don't like that. There's that old mayor of New York, Ed Koch, used to say that if you agree with me on 80% of the issues, like you should be with me. And if you agree with me on 100% of the issues, you should be in an institution. Um, and I guess I sort of feel like that, but in the food world, everybody is it's so cultural, it's so personal, it's so ideological that I think I get a lot of pushback for not being 100% in with any of the tribes.
Well, I have a fun question for you before we have tons of audience questions, so I want to give extra time to that. But you've been interviewed all over the place, been talking about the book. I saw you a couple of times at Climate Week, but I think the most fun one maybe was your time last week on the Daily Show, or I think the week before last. Tell us about it. Like,
I
how
mean, that
was it?
was that
Were
was
you
super.
nervous?
I oddly was. I mean, at this point, I've done a bunch of these things, but I really was. And what I will say about the Daily Show, and this is not always true of everybody in television, but
Mhm.
they are super nice people. I've been on the show a couple times in the past, and in fact, the first time I was on, again, never pushing a book before, but the first time I was on, there was this like kid producer who was really hit it off with, and
Okay.
he's now the executive producer.
Wow.
So that probably has something to do with how I got on. But it was funny. We were joking about shrooms. We were joking about farts. Um, but I've really tried to, like you said, I really want people to get the message of the book, and so I
Yes.
really have been like I did Steve Bannon's show too, And
Yep.
that was pretty fun. He actually said something much, his quote that I've been joking I should put on the blurb of the paperback edition. He said, "Man, Grunwald, everybody's going to hate you."
Oh,
Um,
wow.
but look, I think, and I should say I've also done a bunch of these, like I did the Flipping the Table regenerative podcast. I did a debate with an agroecology professor at Berkeley with Alice Waters staring daggers at me in the front row.
Mhm.
As you said, I did Food Tank, which was maybe not the friendliest audience, but it was a really civil and I thought really interesting discussion.
Mhm.
So I'm really trying to yap about this stuff to anybody who will listen. And obviously the Daily Show, we got to joke about this stuff too.
Yeah, I think that's great. And to your point, like ultimately, what we do know is that to create change across the food system, we actually need everybody. So we need people from both sides of the aisle. We need people from rural America and urban America. We need everyone to have motivation to create that change. So I'm appreciative that you're going out and having that conversation with everyone. So
Oh,
turning over to
sure.
a couple audience questions, and
Yeah.
so um, first off, since cutting waste and reducing meat consumption overall, even both those things are not enough. We know we need to change other things. A question for the audience was, would reducing consumption of processed food help? All this, info about ultra processed foods, etc. Does that help?
So, well, processed meat, definitely, and processed beef particularly. But I will say, and this is an interesting, I should say like I really do at this point. I mean, I don't know, the word's probably thrown around, but I'm at least putting myself out there as a kind of environmental expert, I guess. On the nutrition stuff, I should say I kind of know just enough to be dangerous. But my sense is that ultra processed food is a real nutrition problem. Um, and a lot of people who are smarter and more knowledgeable than me have said a lot of important things about it. Um, what I will say, the environmental aspects and the agricultural aspects of processed food, like how something is grown does not have a lot to do with how healthy it is. That's part of what everybody's pissed at me now because I just wrote this piece about glyphosate, about Roundup in the New York Times, which and people would like to say that glyphosate is killing us all, and they show that yes, we're using a lot more glyphosate and we are also getting a lot sicker. But correlation is not causation, and we are eating a lot of crap. And yes, that crap was grown with a lot of that, Twinkies are bad for you. Doritos are bad for you. And yes, they're both made of things that were once sprayed with glyphosate. But Doritos and Twinkies are not bad because they have GMO corn in it or because they were sprayed with glyphosate. They're bad because they're Doritos and Twinkies. And uh, and so I think from an environmental perspective and even a health perspective, this idea that like, oh, if it's our agricultural system that's making us sick, I don't think that's true. And the reverse is that if we ate healthier foods, um, that's if we ate less meat, that would, and that a lot of red meat is unhealthy, eating too much of it. That would be better for the climate. But eating fewer processed foods, which we should do for our health, but that wouldn't necessarily help the climate. I will say that like people hate corn, they hate soy, but those are very efficient crops. And if we got rid of them all tomorrow, they'd be replaced with less efficient forms of feed that would use more land to make the same amount of food.
Is there anything in your perspective too around you talked a little bit about kind of traditional farming and regen. Any perspectives on vertical farming, these big greenhouses or anything like that?
So I do have a little section about vertical farming. And it should be, because gosh, you look at a vertical farm, it eats less of the earth, right? It's instead of sprawling, across Visalia, California, they're growing lettuce in a skyscraper in Newark. And instead of having a harvest every, twice a year, you're having it every 2 weeks. And there's no fertilizer runoff. The burbs aren't pooping on the crops. There's a lot to love about it, um, but it doesn't really pencil out. Um, right now the big problem is energy. Ultimately, I think they'll solve some of them, and I think it's going to be a really good source of like really good way to grow lettuce, tomatoes, strawberries, which are the highest margin item in the grocery store in the produce section. I learned, it's great for growing weed, right? Another high margin crop. Uh, that said, it's not going to solve the food problem. Um, what I will say is it's kind of interesting. One way it can help is that these greenhouses and particularly the pure vertical farms that don't use the sun. The plants growing in them are some of the most studied and watched plants in history. They're constantly their images. So we are learning a lot about how plants grow from these indoor farms that will
Mhm.
hopefully be useful for outdoor farms. But in general, I think, the main thing I notice about indoor farming is that it's the kind of thing that reminds us about how difficult outdoor farming is, where you have things like night and weather and, ecosystems that you need to be careful with. It's really hard what farmers do. And it would be really cool if we could just do it indoors, but nobody's really figured out how to grow rice and wheat and corn and soy and beef and chicken in vertical farms yet.
Yeah, yeah, those staple, um, maybe what people call commodity crops have not yet
Yeah.
figured that model out yet, if it is even solvable. But to your point, all the variables you can control are very interesting in that
Yeah.
model.
And solving the lettuce problem is good, right? Like we use like I think almost 300,000 acres of the United States to grow lettuce. So if we, could do it in 1,000, that would be amazing. Now we use 300 million acres of the United States to grow crops. So it's a very small part of the problem, but again, we should try to solve small parts of the problem. So
Yeah, they add
hopefully,
up. And to your point, if we can have the Salinas Valley and Yuma, Arizona,
mhm.
reallocated to other agricultural products, that might be
Awesome.
a huge opportunity. So I think this might be a question for me, but I would love your perspective on it. Like, what can we as citizens or non-scientists do to get involved with um, movements to reduce food waste? Any perspectives that you have of kind of that citizen non-scientist perspective?
Yeah, and as you know, like a lot of the environmental movement is very down on this idea that sort of individual actions matter, right? It's kind of like, oh, what matters is politics, like Donald Trump. What matters is like, corporations, Exxon, JBS, or whoever. And I'm very much from the yeah, those matter a lot, but so do, yes, your actions are just a drop in the bucket, but drops fill buckets, and particularly on food waste and reducing meat consumption. Those
Mm-hmm.
are both in, the Project Drawdown does a list of the top 100 solutions for reducing emissions. And those are both in the top five. And those are both, there's both a lot individuals can do. Like I don't eat beef, for example. I'm not vegan because I guess, we all find the level of hypocrisy that we're comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
But so, that's something I do, and I try, I think it's great to try to eat less beef. I also don't waste food at home because I have a mill dehydrator.
Mm-hmm.
And that's this kind of cool, nice looking garbage can designed by the guys who invented the Nest thermostat.
Mm-hmm.
And basically we throw all of our kitchen scraps into our mill, and overnight it turns it into chicken feed. So, and then at the end of the month, we send it to mill and it's fed to chickens. So it obviously reduces methane in the landfill, but it
Mm-hmm.
also reduces the amount of land used to grow soybeans for chickens. So that's like an example. Now they gave me mine. Right now, mill is still very expensive, but I think we can use public policy to promote mill, subsidize mill for ordinary homeowners. And then I do think there are a lot of nudges that particularly universities and hospitals and institutions can use to try to get people to waste less food. There's a lot of behavioral science where if you give people smaller plates, if you don't give them a tray, if you charge food by the pound or by the ounce rather than a la carte, people tend to eat less. It's hard, as you know. I did that story a while back about how even as mad as people are about food prices, since 2021, when food inflation really began, households have not been reducing less food, have not been reducing their food waste. So you've seen some real improvements at the grocery level. Um, and again, some technologies on the, with their inventory, as well as apps like Flash Food, right? Um, or even upcycling, like Matriarch Foods, which is taking food waste and and trying to make it into, whether it's pet food or snacks. There are a lot of opportunities in the supply chain, I think, to help. Um, but for individuals, I think it's just, try to be conscious, try to plan your meals in advance, and, try not to have your eyes bigger than your stomach.
Yeah.
I'm sure you can do it better
Yeah,
than I
I would
can.
just double down on a couple areas. One is the number one area within the supply chain, and we say from field to landfill, is at the consumer. It's in the household. It's in our own homes. Is the number one place, and that is both restaurant, our leftovers that we throw in the trash because we didn't consume them, and or what we didn't eat, of our own grocery bill. And so there's lots and lots of actions. We have quick information about that on the Refed website. But I would also encourage folks to, shameless plug. We just relaunched the Food Waste Action Network, which is actually a collaborative of general citizens as well as other leaders who aren't necessarily working in the food system but want to take action on food waste. And so I'm going to ask my team to put a link to the sign up there. We're creating kind of a community of people who are engaged, who want to take action. And we're hoping that folks will share kind of their interests as well as the resources they have. And we can create a community of sharing information with folks and help them create kind of sub movements within their sphere of influence, whether that's just in your own household, whether that's in your community, whether that's in your business. So I'll put that link there as well, because actually, there's a significant, huge impact that you can, as a person, make and influence. So the next question is, we're losing a lot of usable farmland. How do you have any experience, or did you do any research on like suburban design, city planning to try to get like gardens and crops in urban environments? Do you think that's part of the solution?
Well, sure. I mean, I do. Again, I think those of us, and again, I live in Miami, so I'm not getting on my high horse here, but I do think those of us who live in urban and suburban areas, where often urban and suburban sprawl is the main threat to farmland, we tend to, and the main threat to nature as well. We tend to sort of, we're talking our own book, so to speak, right? We are concerned about what we see, and I do think it's important to keep in mind that agricultural sprawl worldwide is 40 times as big as urban and suburban sprawl.
Mm-hmm.
That's a much bigger threat. I do think, you know, one real message of my book, I mean, is that land is not free, and every acre is sacred. Is Those are sort of two phrases that I use. They come from the main character of my book, Tim Searchinger, and the idea is that, first of all, like, our climate studies up until quite recently really ignored the impact of land use, and they treated land as if it were free. And so, from a just technical analysis, it's really important that we stop doing that. Like, right now, our carbon markets really kind of ignore the importance of land. So, like, those ranches I wrote about in Brazil, where they're being incredibly productive, if they wanted to get paid by the carbon markets, they should probably redegrade their land and get rid of their cows, because then they'll have, less methane. They'll, stop fertilizing their pastures, so they'll have less nitrous oxide. They get no credit for the fact that they're saving the
Mm-hmm.
Amazon through their productivity. Um, so So yeah, land is not free, but also land really is sacred, that every acre matters and it all needs to be used as efficiently as possible, right? We think of land as sort of infinite, but it's
Mhm,
not. It's not. And we can't keep using more of it. So that means like in an urban setting, like urban trees are really important for,
mhm,
for shade, but also for carbon storage. And I think they add to quality of life. That's great. Urban agriculture, it can be good if you're using a rooftop. That means you can't use that rooftop for solar. If you're using an empty lot, that's great. But if you're using that empty lot instead of a skyscraper, and instead of that skyscraper, you're going to have, you know, 100 houses out in Sprawlville, there's an opportunity cost there. So again, I think in general, like having a garden instead of a lawn, that's a win. You're making food instead of not making food. Um,
mhm.
but I guess the point is that land has a few jobs, right? It's got to shelter us. It's got to grow food. It's got to store carbon. Um, and any piece of land, we want it to be doing one of those or more than one of those things as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to your point of like it almost is a big math equation to your point of
Yeah.
we use the land for that, but what is the downstream implications to your point of
Yeah.
that urban sprawl neighborhood that now develops
And the
super
math
fast?
sucks, right? People say like, "Oh, like, but I eat local," and it's like, well, that's great, but the main climate problem with our food is not how far it travels. It's basically like what it is and how it's made. And so if you're eating very inefficiently grown beef that comes from, next door, that is not as good for the climate as eating, tofu made from GMO soybeans shipped from Brazil. You know, it's really it's not always obvious, and that's why my these riffs are not always satisfying to people.
Yeah. So question about the book itself. Your editors asked for a shorter book. Are you going to do a sequel? Are you going to or are you going to continue writing about the food system? Have you just gotten a taste for it and decided you want more?
So I'm not going to write a sequel, God forbid. This just came out, but I am definitely going to keep writing about the food system. I've decided because remember, I went into my cave for 5 years. I was really, I was researching and writing this book, and I kind of disappeared from the public world. And now I have a lot that I want to say and a lot that I want to learn about this stuff. And so yeah, I'm going to be writing occasional columns for the New York Times. I write columns for an Eating the Earth column for Canary Media, and I have a bunch of other outlets that I'm going to be writing for. And I really do because I think that there's a lot to say about this stuff, and and I think there's a lot of people that people don't know, and then there's a lot of stuff that people think they know that just isn't so. So,
Mhm.
so I'm trying to fill that void for a while. Yeah.
Great. And you have lots of different vehicles to do it, not just books. So people can definitely look to a lot of your journalism and you have all those different outlets, which is great too.
I hope they read
Um,
the book though. It's,
oh yeah,
it's more fun than it sounds. It's like I did try to make it a narrative. So,
it is a very interesting book. I have it here. It will soon find its way onto my orange shelf over there now that I've read the
color
whole thing.
coded is
But
cool.
yeah, I mean, definitely encourage folks to pick it up and read a copy. Um, I guess my question, I have two last final questions for you.
Yeah.
One is, what's step one? Where do we start? Like, where do we go next from here? What do you think when you think about like the one thing? Where do you go?
Well, I do think this idea that, even though it's a cliche, like a few years ago, people didn't even connect food and climate and the environment.
Mhm.
And I think that is starting to change. I mean, at Climate Week, you couldn't walk down the street without bumping into a food and climate event. Now, unfortunately, in my opinion, mostly they were regenerative ag will save the world and with like an organic chef and and a regenerative farmer and somebody from PepsiCo and General Mills and Archer Daniels Midland talking about how we need to pour more money into this stuff. And I think that could be misguided. But I do think this combination of, public consciousness in the climate and food conversation, this idea that we're eating the earth is really important. And then for individuals, this idea of a kind of new land ethic, um, where we sort of think about our food and our land in a different way, where essentially we want to eat foods and farm in ways that we use less of the earth.
Mhm.
That we I think that is really where it starts. So for an individual, I think it does start with like eating a little less beef and wasting a little less food. Um, but also, just sort of being conscious when we think about these larger debates about, whether it's glyphosate, like, is it as bad as people say? And if we got rid of glyphosate, does that mean that we are going to need more acres of land to make the same amount of food? Just thinking about these trade-offs is, I think, where it starts, because for way too long, nobody's really been thinking about them.
Right. And then my last one is love to end on a note of optimism or hope. What what optimism do you have around the food system, and can we really achieve being able to feed our full population in 2050? Do you think it's achievable, and what glimmers of hope? Maybe it's, and I will don't want to lead the witness here, but like maybe it's an example of somewhere that you're seeing success already, or areas where you're seeing momentum. Like what gives you hope in this?
Sure. I mean, well, I should say, like, I write about like dozens of potential solutions in this book, and there's
Mhm.
a lot of them are really exciting. And on the production side, it's things like biopesticides that are made with the mRNA technology behind the COVID vaccines that constipate beetles to death, or biofertilizers that gene edit microbes to snatch nitrogen out of the air and feed it to crops so you don't have to dump chemicals on them. On the food waste side, you see things like Appeal Sciences, right, which is basically uses a organic, invisible, tasteless peel that they put around,
Mhm.
bananas or avocados so that they don't spoil as quickly, and that's very exciting. I mentioned Mill, and they're just all kinds. Like I met hundreds of really smart, interesting, mission-driven people who are trying to solve that problem, and that makes me really optimistic, because that's, as a species, we're not always great about like making sacrifices for the planet, but we're pretty good at solving problems that we put our minds to, and inventing cool stuff. So I see that happening on the food side. Now, I should say, none in the United States, none of those solutions really have any traction. The problem's still getting worse every day, and so that bums me out. But if we're going to do the most hopeful, it's probably Denmark, which I know it's like Denmark is like the model nation. They're always doing all kinds of like model nation kinds of things. Well, they've basically passed the Michael Grunwald Food and Agriculture Act of 2025, where they're investing in alternative proteins and trying to get Danes to eat less meat. But at
Mhm.
the same time, they did not, even despite a lot of pressure from environmentalists, they are not shutting down their very efficient uh, pork and dairy industries. Instead, they are trying to make it even more efficient by trying a lot of these technologies that I've been talking about, whether it's like feed additives that can help the cows burp less methane,
Mhm.
or, gene edited crops that they don't have to use as much land to feed the cows and the pigs. But at the same time, they're going to have a tax on agricultural emissions. They're going to rewild 1 million acres of their marginal farmland to make them wetlands again.
Mhm.
They're really doing all the things. They're going to make more food with less land and less mess. And the hope is not that that's important, because I mean there's 6 million Danes. They're
Mhm.
not. They're a global rounding error. But the hope is that, first of all, they show that it can be done, and second, that they can be really a model for the rest of the world. I know it's going to be like hard. The United States isn't Denmark, but they have a very powerful agricultural industry, and their agricultural industry was on board, so it can happen. And like I say, like perfect probably isn't on the menu, but
Mhm.
better is better than worse. And I do think there are going to be a lot of opportunities, um, food waste being probably the most politically palatable one to make things better, even over the next few years.
Yeah, and I totally agree. Better is better than worse, and I do think that whether it's Denmark or some other areas where they're seeing significant progress and kind of that system-wide change, which is really interesting to see how that changes. But the good news too in the US, there's plenty of momentum, especially on the food waste, where you're seeing that complementary systems. California is working when an organic waste ban combined with investment in food recovery, combined with different supporting for food businesses to do that. We can see reductions in food waste that are really significant in a short period of time when we get that systems change. And so I think that that is a hopeful note to end on. And so, Mike, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing. We appreciate you. And everybody, check out the book. It will, if anything, definitely make you think and challenge you. And we really appreciate that. Thank you again. Have a great day.